Strange, I thought the tigress should have appeared long ago. She would not take 45 minutes to cover half a mile. And then a horrible feeling of imminent danger came over me. Many times before had that obscure sixth sense, which we all possess but few develop, stood me in good stead in my many wanderings in the forests of India and Burma. I had not the slightest doubt that somehow, in spite of all my precautions, complete screening and absolute stillness, the tigress had discovered my presence and was at that moment probably stalking me preparatory to a final spring. In moments of danger, we who know the jungle think quickly. It is not braveness that goads the mind to such quick thinking, for I confess that at this moment I was very afraid and could feel beads of cold sweat trickling down my face. I knew the tigress could not be on the watercourse itself, or below me, or I would have seen her long before. She might have been on the opposite bank, hidden in the dense undergrowth and watching my position, but somehow I felt that her presence there would not account for the acutely growing sense of danger that increasingly beset me. She could only be above and behind me. Suddenly it was borne home to me that the 4-foot wall of rock behind me prevented me from looking backwards unless I raised myself to a half-crouching, half-kneeling position, which would make a steady shot almost impossible, apart from completely giving away my position to any watcher on the opposite bank, or on the watercourse bed itself. Momentarily, I cursed myself for this lack of forethought, which now threatened to become my undoing. As I hesitated for another second, a thin trickle of sand slid down from above, probably dislodged by the killer, now undoubtedly very close above me, and gathering herself for a final spring. I hesitated no longer, I forced my numbed legs to raise me to a half-crouching position, simultaneously slewing the cocked .405 around, till the end of the muzzle was in line with my face. Then I raised myself a fraction higher, till both my eyes and the muzzle came above the ledge. A fearful sight revealed itself. There was the tigress, hardly 8 feet away and extended on her belly, in the act of creeping down the sloping rock towards me. As our eyes met in surprise, we acted simultaneously, the tigress to spring with a nerve-shattering roar, while I ducked down again, at the same moment contracting my trigger finger. The heavy blast of the rifle, level with and only a few inches from my ears, mingled with that demoniacal roar to create a sound which often till this day haunts me in my dreams and causes me to awaken, shivering with fear. The brute had not anticipated the presence of the ledge behind which I sheltered, while the blast and blinding flash of the rifle full in her face evidently disconcerted her, deflecting her aim and deviating her purpose from slaughter to escape. She leapt right over my head, and in passing her hind foot caught the muzzle of the rifle a raking blow, so that it was torn from my grasp and went slithering, but first, down the sloping rock, to fall dully on the soft sand below, where it lay beside the half-eaten corpse. Quicker than the rifle, the tigress herself reached the watercourse bed, and in 2 bounds and another coughing roar was lost to view in the thickets of the opposite bank. Shocked and hardly aware of what had happened, I realized I was unarmed and helpless, and that should the tigress return on her tracks, there was just nothing I could do. At the same time, to descend after the rifle would undoubtedly single me out for attack, if the animal were lying wounded in the bushes of the opposite bank. But anything seemed preferable to indecision and helplessness, and I dived down the slope to retrieve the rifle and scramble back, expecting at each second to hear the awful roar of the attacking killer. But nothing happened, and in less time than it takes to tell I was back at the ledge. A quick examination revealed that no harm had come to the weapon in its fall, the stock having absorbed the shock. Replacing the spent cartridge, I fell to wondering whether I had hit the tigress at all, or if I had missed her at ridiculously close range. Then I noticed something black and white on the ledge behind me and barely 2 feet away. Picking it up, I found it was the major portion of the tigress ear, which had been torn off by my bullet at that close range. It was still warm to my touch, and being mostly of skin and hair, hardly bled along its torn edge. To say that I was disappointed and chagrined could not describe 1/10 of my emotions. I had failed to kill the man-eater at a point-blank range, failed even to wound her in the true sense. The tearing off of her ear would hardly inconvenience her, beyond causing slight local pain. For a few days. On the other hand, my foolish miss would teach her never to return to a kill the second time. This would make her all the more cunning, all the more dangerous and all the more destructive, because now she would have to eat when she killed, and then kill again when she felt hungry, increasing her killings beyond what would have been normally necessary. She might even alter her sphere of activities and remove herself to some other part of the country, where the people would not be aware of the arrival of a man-eater and so fall still easier prey. I cursed myself throughout that night, hoping against hope that the tigress might show up again, but all to no purpose. Morning, and the return of my men, found me chilled to the marrow, disconsolate and disappointed beyond expression. The hot tea and sandwiches they brought, after my long fast since the previous forenoon, followed by a pipeful of strong tobacco, somewhat restored my spirits and caused me to take a slightly less critical view of the situation which, after all, might have been far worse. Had it not been for my sixth sense, I would undoubtedly have been lying a partially devoured corpse beside that of the previous day's unfortunate victim. I had something to be really thankful for. Approaching the spot into which the tigress had leapt, we cast about for blood spoor, but, as I had expected, found none, beyond a very occasional smear from the damaged ear against the leaves of bushes, as the tigress had retreated from what had turned out for her a very surprising situation. Even these we eventually lost some distance away, so that it was an unhappy party of persons that returned to the small village in Anchety, and eventually Gundalam, to report complete failure. I remained at Gundalam for a further 10 days, persistently tying out my buffalo baits each day, although I had little hope of success. Whole mornings and afternoons I devoted to scouring the forest in search of tracks, and nights were spent in sitting over waterholes, game trails, and along the bed of the Gundalam River in the hope of the tigress showing up, but all to no avail. Parties of men went out in the daytime in all directions, to secure news of further kills, but nothing had happened. Apparently the tigress had deserted her haunts and gone off to healthier localities. On the 11th day I left Gundalam, tramping to Anchety in Denkanikota. From there I traveled to Hosur, where I told my friend the sub-collector of all that had happened and extracted from him a promise that he would tell me immediately of further kills, should they occur, as I now felt myself responsible for the welfare of the people of the locality. Then, leaving Hosur, I returned to my home at Bangalore. 5 months passed, during which time I received 3 letters from the sub-collector, telling of vague rumors of human tiger kills from distant places, 2 being from across the Kaveri River in the Coimbatore district, 1 from Mysore state territory, and the 4th from a place still further away. Then suddenly came the bad news I feared, but had hoped would not eventuate. A tiger had struck again at Gundalam, killing her 8th victim there, and the next evening had snatched, from the very door of the little temple at Sulakunta, the old priest who had attended to the place for the last 40 years. The letter concluded with the request to come at once. Such urgent invitation was unnecessary, for I had been holding myself in readiness for the worst. Within 2 hours I was motoring to Jowlagiri. Arriving there I was fortunate in being able to talk to one of the party of pilgrims who had almost been eyewitnesses to the death of the old priest of the temple at Sulakunta. Apparently a party of men had been on pilgrimage and, as they approached the temple itself, were horrified to hear the low growl of a tiger, which then leapt into the forest from the roots of a giant peepal tree that grew some 30 yards away. Bolting for shelter into the temple itself, they were surprised to find it tenantless, and looking out were aghast to see the body of the old priest lying within the folds of the gnarled roots of the old peepal tree that directly faced them. After some time, and very timidly, they approached in a group, to find that the old man had apparently been attacked in, or very near, the temple, and then been carried to this spot to be devoured. The tiger had already begun its meal, consuming part of the skinny chest, when it had been disturbed by the pilgrim party. I particularly inquired as to whether my informant, or his companions, had noticed anything wrong with the tiger's ears, but obviously they had all been too frightened to observe any defects. I hurried to Sulakunta with my party of 3 and arrived near dusk. I must confess that the last 2 miles of the journey had been very uncomfortable, traversing a valley between 2 steeply sloping hills that were densely clothed with bamboo. But we heard and saw nothing, beyond the sudden trumpeting of a solitary elephant, which had been inhabiting these parts for some time and had been a considerable annoyance to pilgrims, whom he apparently delighted to chase if they were in small parties. But that is another story. There was no time to make a proper camp, so we decided to sleep in the deserted front portion of the temple itself, a proceeding which I, and very decidedly my followers, would have declined to do under normal circumstances. But nightfall and the proximity of a man-eater are apt to overcome all scruples and principles. I stood guard with the loaded rifle, while my 3 men frenziedly gathered brushwood and rotting logs that lay in plenty nearby, to build a fire for our warmth and protection, for on this occasion there was no friendly moon and it would soon be dark. Under such circumstances, attempting to sit up for the man-eater, in the hope of its passing near the temple, would have been both highly dangerous and futile. Soon we had a bright fire blazing, on the inner side of which we sat, away from the pitch-black jungle. Night, which could easily have sheltered the murderer, all unknown to us, within a distance of 2 feet. Listening intently, we occasionally heard the deep belling boom of somber, and I could discern the harsher note of a stag, but these did not follow in persistent repetition, showing that the animals had not been unduly alarmed by any such major foe as the king of the Indian jungle. After midnight we arranged to keep watch in 2s, 3 hours at a time, and I elected, with one of my companions, to take first turn. The other 2 were soon asleep. Nothing untoward happened, however, beyond the fact that the solitary tusker, who had approached near enough to catch a sudden sight of the fire, trumpeted once again and crashed away. A kakur, or barking deer, uttered its sharp cry around 2 a.m., but as this was not continued, I decided it had been disturbed by a wandering leopard. 3 o'clock came, I awoke the 2 sleeping men, and in turn fell into a dreamless sleep, to awaken to the early and spirited cry of a grey jungle cock, saluting the rising sun. Hot tea, made with water from the well nearby, and some food gave us new life and heart, after which I walked across to the giant pepple tree and inspected the remains of the old priest. The vultures by day, and hyenas and jackals by night, had made a good job of him, for nothing remained but a few cleanly picked bones, at the sight of which I fell to reminiscing about the old man who had tended his temple for the past 40 years, looking daily upon the same view as the one I now saw, hearing the same night sounds of somber, kakur and elephant as I had heard that night, and was now but a few bones, folded in the crevices of the hoary pepple tree. For the next hour we cast around in the hope of finding pug marks and perhaps identifying the slayer, but although we saw a few old trails, I could not with any certainty classify them as having been made by my tigress. By 9 a.m. we left on the long 23-mile trek to Gundalam, where we arrived just after 5 p.m. Here, upon making inquiries about the recent killing, I gleaned the first definite information about the slayer from a herdsman who had been attending to his cattle at the same watershed where I had tied my buffalo bait on my last visit. This man stated that he had had a companion with whom he had been talking, and who had then walked across to a nearby bush to answer a call of nature. He had just squatted down when, beyond the bush, the devilish head of a tiger arose, with only one ear, soon to be followed by an evil, striped body. The man had shrieked once when the fangs sank into the face and throat, and the next instant tiger and victim had disappeared into the jungle. Here at last was the information I had been dreading, but somehow wanting to hear. So, after all, it was now confirmed that the killer was none other than my old enemy, the tigress, who had returned at last to the scene of her former depredations, and for whose return and now vastly increased cunning I was myself responsible. Everywhere I had heard reports that no cattle or buffaloes had been killed by this beast, so I did not waste time, as on the previous occasion, in setting live baits, realizing that I had an adversary to deal with whom I could only hope to vanquish in a chance encounter, face to face. For the next 2 days I again searched the surrounding jungle, hoping by luck to meet the killer, but with fear and dread of being attacked from behind at any moment. Pug marks I came across in plenty, especially on the soft sands of the Gundalam River, where the familiar tracks of the Jowlagiri tigress were plainly in view, adding confirmation to the thought that by my poor shot, some 5 months ago, I had been responsible for several more deaths. At midday on the 3rd day, a party of men arrived in a lather, having covered the 30 miles from Jowlagiri to tell me of a further kill, this time the watchman of the Jowlagiri forest bungalow who had been killed and half-eaten within 100 yards of the bungalow itself, the previous afternoon. Hoping that the tigress might retrace her steps toward Sulakanta and Gundalam, as she was rumored never to stay in the same place for more than a day after making a human kill, I left with my men at once, augmented by the party from Jowlagiri, who, although they had practically run the 30 miles to Gundalam, preferred the return tramp of 25 miles to Sulakanta protected by my rifle rather than return by themselves. Again we reached the temple of Sulakanta as daylight was fading and, as the nights were still dark, repeated our campfire procedure within the temple itself. Our party had now been increased to 12, including myself, a number which, although it made us feel safer, was far too many for my personal comfort. This time, however, we were not to spend a peaceful night. The Sambar and Kakur were restless from nightfall, and at 8:30 p.m. we heard a tiger calling from a spot I judged to be half a mile away. This was repeated an hour later from quite close, and I could then easily distinguish the intonations of a tigress calling for a mate. The tigress had also seen the campfire and become aware of the proximity of humans and, obviously hoping for a meal, she twice circled the temple, her repeated mating calls being interspersed by distinctly audible grunts of anticipation. All this gave me an idea by which I might possibly succeed in keeping her in the vicinity till daylight, at which time only could I hope to accomplish anything. Twice I gave the answering call of a male tiger, and received at once the urgent summons of this imperious female. Indeed, she came to the edge of the clearing and called so loudly as almost to paralyze us all. I was careful, however, not to call while she was in the immediate vicinity, which might have aroused her suspicions. At the same time I instructed the men to talk rather loudly, and not overstoke the already blazing fire, instructions which were doubtlessly most unwelcome. I hoped by these means, between mating urge and appetite, to keep the tigress in the vicinity till daylight. She called again, shortly before dawn and, congratulating myself on my ruse, as soon as it became light enough to see I hastened down the path towards Jowlagiri where, but a quarter a mile away, stood the tamarind tree beneath which the boy had been killed over a year ago, and which I had already mentally noted as an ideal sitting-up place, requiring no preparation. Reaching the tree in safety, I clambered up some 12 feet to a crotch, which was reasonably comfortable and provided a clear view of the path at both ends. Then, expanding my lungs, I called lustily in imitation of a male tiger. Nothing but silence answered me, and I began to wonder if after all the tigress had moved on at dawn. A new anxiety also gripped me. Perhaps she was near the temple, waiting for one of the men she had marked down the night before to come out of the building. Before departing I had very strictly enjoined my companions not, on any account, to leave the temple, but I felt anxious lest any of them disobey me, perhaps in answer to a call of nature, or to get water from the well that was temptingly near. I called a second time. Still no answer. After a short interval, and expanding my lungs to bursting point, I called again. This time I was successful, for my voice penetrated the intervening forest and was picked up by the tigress, who immediately answered from the direction of the temple. I had been right in my surmise, the wily animal had gone there to look for a meal. After a few minutes I called a fourth time and was again answered by the tigress. I was overjoyed to find that she was coming in my direction in search of the mate she thought was waiting. I called twice more, my last call being answered from barely 100 yards. Leveling the rifle, I glanced along the sights to a spot on the path about 25 yards away. I judged she would take less than 30 seconds to cover the intervening distance. I began to count, and as I reached 27 the tigress strode into full view, inquiringly looking for her mate. From my commanding height in the tree her missing ear was clearly visible, and I knew that at last, after many tiring efforts, the killer was within my power. This time there would be no slip. To halt her onward movement, I moaned in a low tone. She stopped abruptly and looked upwards in surprise. The next second the .405 bullet crashed squarely between the eyes, and she sank forward in a lurching movement and lay twitching in the dust. I placed a second shot into the crown of her skull, although there was no need to have done so. Actually, this second shot did considerable damage to the head and gave much unnecessary extra work to the taxidermist. The dreaded killer of Jowlagiri had come to attain an ignominious end, unworthy of her career, and although she had been a murderer, silent, savage and cruel, a pang of conscience troubled me as to my unsporting ruse in encompassing her end. There is not much more to tell. My 11 followers were elated at the sight of the dead marauder. Soon a stout sapling was cut, to which her feet were lashed by strong creeper vines, and we commenced the 7-mile walk to Jowlagiri, staggering beneath the burden. Because of the man-eater's presence, no humans were afoot until we practically entered the village itself. Then word went round and throngs surrounded us. I allowed the people a short hour in which to feast their eyes on their one-time foe, while I retired to a tree some distance away, where hot tea soon refreshed me, followed by some food, and 2 comforting pipes of tobacco. Then I returned to the village, where willing hands helped me to lash the tigress across the rear seat of my 2-seater Studebaker, to begin my homeward journey with the comforting thought that I had lived down my error and avenged the deaths of many humans.